Bibles to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is where we're going to be this morning, chapter 3. That's around page 690 or so in the Pew Bible in front of you. If you're using that, Daniel chapter 3, we're coming to one of the more famous stories in the Bible, one that maybe some of us, it might be one of the earliest stories that we remember, the story of the fiery furnace. Daniel chapter 3 is where we are going to be this morning. Daniel chapter 3. As we get there, I don't know if you've noticed or heard in the news, but we're in a political election season. Has anyone heard anything about that? Is that, y'all missed that? Okay. Well, just in case you didn't know, there's something in November, elections, stuff like that. But one thing that I think is very interesting, I always find political ads interesting, if I can make it all the way through one. And one of the things that kind of regularly gets emphasized in these political campaigns is that you can play a part in what's going to happen. With your donation of $25 or $50, or if you volunteered to call people or walk door to door, put a sign, you can play a part in the future. We all have a part to play. And that's something that kind of speaks to us, right? We all like the thought of having a meaningful part to play in our culture or in our town or in our society. But what if we as Christians, what if the part that we are called to play in our society, in the place that we have been put, if we're to think about in terms of what part of the body are we, what if we're called to be the sore thumb? Does anyone like having a sore thumb? Anyone really ever nailed their finger with a hammer or something like that? Is that a pleasant experience? No one really enjoys having a sore thumb. But what does a sore thumb do? Well, we all know the phrase, right? It sticks out. It sticks out like a sore thumb. But why? What happens when it's sticking out? Well, it's keeping the hand from doing a lot of things that it would be able to do otherwise. It's kind of a break, a slower, a way of keeping something from moving in a direction that it ought not to go. What if our life as Christians, in our particular moment in the world, is to be a life as a sore thumb? That's what I want us to think about today as we look at this story and consider three sore thumbs in this text: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the part that they play in the world. And what we'll see is that this task has been the task of God's people from the very beginning. And it will continue to be that way until the Lord returns. So we're going to walk through this text in kind of 3 points. One, we're going to think about the compromise that comes with conformity, compromise of conformity. Number 2, we're going to think about the consequence of courage. Number 3, we're going to think about the commitment of Christ. The compromise of conformity, the consequence of courage, and the commitment of Christ. Let's look at verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" This is the first point for us this morning, the compromise of conformity. Nebuchadnezzar is back at it again with his silly kingly ways. We kind of pick right up where we left off last week. Remember in chapter 2, we had this scene where Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. He had this vision, and he was so perplexed by it that he forced someone to figure out how to not only tell him what the dream was, but also to interpret it. And Daniel, the one who this book is named after, interprets this dream about this golden image and how it's made up of these other parts. And it's a story of the history of the world that's going to unfold. And Nebuchadnezzar is so amazed by it, he falls down before Daniel. He praises him. He says, "No God is quite like Daniel's God." He promotes Daniel, and then Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get promoted as well. And now, immediately after this, it seems like Nebuchadnezzar has not learned his lesson. The next thing that happens is Nebuchadnezzar makes an image of gold. Its height is remarkable, probably about 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. It's an odd image if you try to think of what a statue or a sculpture would look like. For it to be 10 times as it is wide, it would be this kind of odd, lurching, monstrous, foreboding creation. Monstrously tall, captivating, intimidating. And he calls all of the people, all of his government leaders to come before him. It mentions a couple times, there's almost this kind of humorous notion where it's almost procedural and listing off everyone that's going to come. It's the satraps, the prefects, the governors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He calls all of these people, and then those people, it's almost like they come in order. The satraps and the prefects and the governors, they all come, and he says, every time that this instrument is played, and this instrument, and this instrument is played, then you listen, and then this instrument was played, and this instrument was played, and it was listened to, and they all fell down and worshiped. Everyone is conformed into this new pattern of worship before Nebuchadnezzar. Again, Babel seems to continue to be at play here. It mentions again that this isn't just a gathering of just a few folks from here and there. It says specifically that it's peoples from all languages and nations. Every kind of person falls down and worships before this creation of the king. Kind of counterfeit reversal of what happened in the Tower of Babel. Remember, Babel and Babylon, they're associated. They're like the same locale. The same thing is happening again. And you get this image that as whatever Nebuchadnezzar says goes. There's almost kind of a mindless activity by those who are listening. There's no resistance to it at all. They conform, they fall in line, they go with it. Now, what is this image? What is we don't get any details about what it is except that it is tall. We don't know if it's a picture, if it's a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know if it's a statue of his gods. We don't know if it's a statue of something else. All we know that it is something that Nebuchadnezzar set up. And maybe that's part of the point. It's being left ambiguous because in a sense, one of the ways that Babylon itself operated was it kind of liked its religion ambiguous. It liked creating things so as they took over different people, they could kind of say, hey, you can kind of worship your God. You can think that you're bowing down to this and you're looking at it, and these people can think that they're bowing down to this. The main thing is that you realize whatever it is that you're bowing down to, it's Nebuchadnezzar who built it. So you can assign your meaning to it. We can all kind of get along as long as we realize the one who truly has the power here is the king. We can all conform, we can all compromise, we can all get along, we can all go along with the system if we just simply stop arguing and listen to the one who is the strongest. Essentially, Nebuchadnezzar is saying to these people, it doesn't matter what you think as long as you bow. It doesn't matter what you're thinking in your mind as long as with your body you show that I am the one in charge. Now that's interesting. An interesting way for a king to try to control all things. And what we see is that this is actually a normal pattern all the way through Scripture. When Jesus finds himself in the wilderness and he's being tempted by the devil, we read the story at home with our girls earlier this week. Satan appears and he takes Jesus to a high mountain. He shows him all the kingdoms of the world. He says, I'll give you all of these. This can all be yours. You have all the strength that you could possibly ever imagine. Every kingdom can be yours if all you do is bow. All you have to do is bow, and then you'll have every kingdom, and you don't even have to go to the cross for it. If you simply worship me, it can all be yours. That's the same temptation all of us are given all the time. It doesn't really matter what you think. It doesn't really matter what you say you believe. It doesn't really matter what you do. As long as you don't really fight the system that is at play, then you will be fine. Conform, compromise, keep your head down, go along with what's happening around you. We all know who your true king is. We know who your true God is. We know who your true fear is. Do not make a fuss. And really, the only reason that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego rise to the surface in this text is because they don't go along with it. It would have been, if they had simply bowed down, we probably would have never heard anything else about them. They probably would have been able to continue in their roles. They probably would have been able to continue doing whatever it was that they were doing. It almost seems as if nothing possibly would have come against them if they just taken a hint, shut up, sat down, and go along with things. If they simply conformed, all would be well. How does this play out in our world today? This is the same system that's at work in plenty of regimes around the world. In China, it's completely okay to attend a church as long as it's a state-sponsored church with state-approved teachings. In Korea, it's completely fine to do the various things that you're allowed to do as long as you bow to the statue of the dictator. In countries I've been in, it's completely fine to do this or that as long as you don't make a noise about it, as long as you keep the picture of the ruler up on your wall in your home so you know that he's watching, he's in control, he is in charge. A totalitarian approach to life. Conformity is a natural component of our existence. But what I want to suggest to you is what if there is a more subtle American flavor of the exact same thing? What if the temptation that is before us is to call whatever we're bowing down to Jesus or God or the Lord or the Bible or conservative values. And meanwhile, it's the exact same thing in reality that everyone else is giving their allegiance to. A secure home, a sense of stability, a lack of fear of others, temptations to assign and accuse and discredit. What if our values actually look just like the values of everyone who is around us, and everyone is okay with us saying that we worship Jesus, we believe in Jesus, we believe the Bible, we want to live in step with the truth, because in reality, we can call it whatever we want. If we're playing by the same rules, it's all the same game. Compromise and conformity takes many different shapes, and we must be willing to challenge what we take to be the status quo and the norm and what is acceptable, because if we're going purely off of how everyone else is living, then we will be right in step with the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the counselors and everyone else in this text who's mentioned. Living in step and in light of everyone else instead of in obedience to what God himself demands is going along with the norm. We were reading last night. We've been reading together at night Prince Caspian, one of the Chronicles of Narnia books. And it's the basic setting of it is it's that the four main children, Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy, and in the first book, they save Narnia and they live as kings and queens, and then they get bumped back out of Narnia and they live kind of a normal life for a year, and then they get sucked back into Narnia, but it's been like 1,000 years in Narnia since they were there. And everything is different, and they're confused, and no one really believes in Aslan, the king, anymore, and no one really knows if Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy were even real, and they're back in this story, and they're trying to figure out how to make everything make sense, and they're trying to get back to this fort where they can help Caspian, the one king who's trying to hold on and trying to lead in the truth, trying to lead in righteousness. And no one knows where Aslan is, but Lucy sees him. Lucy sees him and says, we need to go this way. Aslan's over there. I know I saw him. I know he wants us to go that way. All the children and this dwarf who's with them, who doesn't really buy into all of this stuff, says the much more practical way is to go this way. It looks better, it looks safer, we'll go this way. They go that way, it ends up being a disaster. They have to run away, they flee, they lose a whole day of travel. And then Lucy sees Aslan that night. She finally meets him. She says, I knew it was true. I knew that you were here. I knew that you were over there, and these people just don't listen. And Aslan just stares at her, and then Lucy realizes that even though she saw Aslan, she still chose not to follow. She thought that knowing him, that he was there in her heart would be good enough, but she chose not to act. She decided to go along with those who are saying, let's be practical, let's be level-headed, let's not be ridiculous. He says, you cannot know what would have happened if you had followed me, but all you can know is that you must now. It's the same with us following Jesus. Will we be willing to stick out as these three young men do? In order to do so, we must be shrewd. We must be ever observant of the temptations that surround us. This is why the Apostle Paul says in Romans 12, verse 2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Do not be conformed. Because the reality is, everyone else around us is. But the one truth, the one encouragement we can pick up with this text is that this is nothing new to the Lord. If we look out over our current moment in culture, we look out over our current moment in history, feel like nothing has ever been this bad before, what that's showing is that we have a very limited view of what God's done in history. We need to remember that God has been working in this midst of very overwhelming circumstances for a very long time, and he has not lost yet. And that should give us hope. That should put wind in our sails. That should put steel in our backs and help us to continue. So let's see what then happens as these young men stand up to this accusation. So the number one is the compromise of conformity. Number two, consequence of courage. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the fiery furnace. This is our second point this morning, the consequence of courage. These 3 men answer in a resolved declaration that they will not believe the lie that Nebuchadnezzar has just declared. Nebuchadnezzar has just said, who is the God who could possibly deliver you out of my hands? And they simply say, our God is certainly able to do so. The Lord is able to deliver us from this furnace. He is able to deliver us from you. Why? Because remember what we've already heard about God in the book of Daniel so far. Last week, as we were thinking about Daniel's prayer, he says he's the one who sets up kings. He's the one who removes kings. He's the one who establishes seasons. He's the one who changes seasons. He gives wisdom and knowledge. He is the one who is over all things. God is the one who appeared in this burning fiery bush to Moses, and it was not consumed. So if he can create fire that does not consume, why could he not make fire that does not consume? And he can even deliver us from you. No matter how strong you might think you are, no matter how much affirmation you're getting from everyone else around you, we know that you are but a man. They take the daring step of telling the truth. And then they say it, even if God does not deliver us from this fire, we will not serve your gods. They draw a line in the sand and they say, we will go no further. Now, this is important for us to see that this is, we've seen this dynamic throughout the book of Daniel so far, where on the one hand, there seems to be this encouragement for the people of God to be at pains not to cause unnecessary offense, to seek ways to fit within the system that's at play, to make sure that they're not unduly causing discord and scandal. But at the same time, it seems that there is eventually a place where a line is drawn. And we say, whatever the consequence might be, we cannot go further. Because Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego know that if they were to bow down to this statue, they would be declaring that their God was weaker than Nebuchadnezzar. And they simply said that was false. And Nebuchadnezzar, in his anger, in his rage, in his fury, as the text says, instantly orders them to be captured. There's no trial. There's no preparation for this. It says that they're bound with their nice clothes still on. They're still wearing their hats and their robes and their garments. They're tied up. They heat this furnace hotter than it's ever been heated before. The men who are binding them up are consumed by the fire. It's so hot. And they are thrown in. This is the consequence of courage. And even still, realize that these men are offering to Nebuchadnezzar a gift. They're offering the gift of humility. They're offering him the gift of the truth. And they don't want it. Sometimes the only way to honor the emperor is to tell him that he has no clothes. Sometimes the only way for us to navigate the world around us is for us to simply say no, regardless of what the consequence might be. And the challenge for us then is to ask, what is it that we must exercise the courage to stand up against? What is it that you, the place that you've been placed, the place that you find yourself in life, what are the powers that be demanding you bow to? What lie is being presented to you that you are being forced to conform to, that you must find the courage to say no to? Is it the lie that ultimate security and rest will be found when you have a certain level of financial success? Or when this milestone gets accomplished, or this place gets reached, or this achievement is checked off? Is it the lie of social acceptance? That you're nothing if you do not have the respect of others. That you're nothing if people if people saw you for what you really are. That you are nothing if you simply opened yourself up to be seen. So you have to keep up appearances. You have to keep up a good act. You have to keep everything moving so it looks like you are competent. Is it the lie at your work? That cutting corners, overcharging customers, laying down fees is okay? Is it a lie that you're told on the news that if one politician wins, that all will be lost? Is it a lie that you're told on the news that if the other person wins, that they'll fix all of our nation's problems? Is it the lie that you're never going to be enough? The lie that everything is riding on you, that you have to hold everything together, but you can't do it? Is it the lie that your secret habit, or the thing that you keep close to yourself, the thing that seems to weigh down on your back constantly, that thing is unbreakable and cannot be changed? What is the lie? What is the thing that seems so patently obvious to you that when observed closely actually shows itself to be false? Standing before Nebuchadnezzar's 90-foot statue would easily convince you that he has all things put together. But these three boys were willing to say that that was not true. What must you do? And then, what if standing up to that lie takes you to the grave? Let's not jump to the happy ending yet, because we kind of know where the story is going. We haven't gotten there yet, but if you've heard the story, you kind of know it resolves, it's happy, everything works out well. But where we're at right now is that they are thrown into the furnace. What if your courage leads to your rejection? In order to endure that, you are going to need more than just courage and strength in yourself. You're going to need conviction that what God says about himself is true. We will need to believe what these young men confess. We must be willing to say, we will not bow to what the world demands we bow to. The consequence of courage. So where are you there? Where must you stand up? And then what happens when we do? What confidence can we have if we go through with this? How can we know that even if death comes knocking, that we will be okay? That brings us to verse 24. Our third point this morning, the commitment of Christ. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The sight of the strongest men of Babylon being consumed in fire as these other young boys fall into this furnace. Essentially, picture this furnace as just this giant metal object that has a door to take things out of and a hole to throw things in from the top. So overwhelming that he's astonished and he rises up in haste to see what possibly could have happened. And then he's struck by a disturbing, unsettling vision as he looks into this furnace. He sees, not only does he see 3 young men who have not been harmed in the slightest, he sees a 4th man in there with them as well. They're brought out. Nebuchadnezzar cannot help but declare that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego worship the true high God. The language gets used that the fire had no power over their bodies. No power has possibly come against the people of God that they have not been able to make it through to where God intends to take them. The God of the Hebrews has power over nature itself, and with this mysterious figure, this 4th man, whose appearance is like the sons of the gods, this one who is declared to be an angel or a messenger by Nebuchadnezzar, is a clear testimony to these 3 young men and to the watching crowds that their God is with them in the midst of their pain. A clear testimony that God's presence has not abandoned them when they are in exile or when they're under the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar or when they are suffering and when they're even at the moment of death. God has not left them. And you, wherever you are, whatever challenges face you, whatever moments are before you, whatever diagnoses are laying out there, whatever fears are resting upon you about the future, about your life, about this country, about your kids, or about your job, there is no aspect of your suffering that God is distant from. There's no component of your experience that God has somewhat said, that's just too much for me. I don't want to get close to that. That's not that. God's not just kind of standing away and looking and saying, what are they possibly going to do? God, in his mercy, shows himself in the midst. He shows himself in the fires with his people. He does not abandon them. That's why this 3rd point for us is so crucial. It is the commitment of Christ. God does not leave his people to their suffering, but he meets them in it. He does not just simply promise to deliver us from suffering. He promises to be there with us in our suffering. And he shows himself and declares to this watching world that he is with those who stick out. He is with those who place themselves against the world. No matter how much power Nebuchadnezzar has, he does not have this 4th man standing with them. That is a gift for those who humble themselves before the Lord. God has no interest in distancing himself from his people when they are at their greatest need. But how do we know that this will be true for us? How do we know that God will meet us in our moments of challenge? I've never been thrown into a fiery furnace, but I've had moments where I have felt utterly alone. I have had moments where I have felt like everything was working against what is good and true. I have had moments where I have felt as if nothing possibly could come from that circumstance. How do we know that God's with us there when we can't see him? How do we know that God's not abandoning us? How do we know that if they had been consumed, how do we know that God was faithful still? Because Jesus himself is the ultimate sign of God's nearness. Jesus himself is the ultimate sign of God's commitment to his people, because in Jesus, he did not just simply appear as this vision. He did not just simply appear as someone who is close to us. Jesus himself got near to us, took on our own flesh, took on flesh and blood and bones and DNA and put it upon himself. He lived a perfect life in our midst. Jesus brought himself close up and near to the deep, detailed, particular sufferings of a particular group of people in a particular time in the middle of nowhere, Israel and Galilee. He touched lepers, he touched the sick, he touched the disease, and he was not contaminated by it, but he identified with them. He drew himself near, and as they found themselves near him, they themselves were made whole. Jesus made himself close to the sufferings of his people, and Jesus ultimately has bound us to himself by dying upon the cross and raising from the grave and pronouncing the good news of his resurrection. We have been made one with him. And it is because Jesus himself suffered abundantly by himself. Jesus had no one beside him on the cross except for two thieves. Jesus found himself utterly alone, hanging upon a cross, a sign of total abandonment by the love of the Father. And he did so that we might be made one with him in his resurrection. How do we know that God will meet us in our moments of pain? Because Jesus himself has already met us in our sin. He has already spilled his blood for us, made us alive, and tied us to himself. And he has promised that no one of his children will be lost. Christ has committed himself to his people. And so, whether we're delivered from the furnace or not is actually immaterial. Because the great hope we have is that one day our bodies will be raised. One day Jesus himself will return and all things will be made alive. And our bodies, no matter what suffering they endure, no matter what difficulties they have to carry on their shoulders, no matter how much grief shakes our frames in the night, Jesus will make it new. And the resurrection will undo all harms. And so when we think about the language that Peter used as he is walking his suffering Christians through their difficulties, when he says that this fiery trial has come upon you to test you, we can be confident that no matter what level of fire and heat we face, our God is with us even then. And he will not leave. And so we can have courage, we have conviction, and most importantly, we can have hope. So will you have the courage to recognize that the strength of man, whether that's someone outside of you or whether that's you yourself, will ultimately fail? We have the courage to acknowledge that you, in and of yourself, are weak, that you, in and of yourself, have very little hope of making it through the flames, that you, in and of yourself, are just as trapped in the lies that we are told day after day after day, but that Jesus has changed all things. that Jesus has known these same accusations, that Jesus has had the same temptations come against him, and he went through it victoriously. That's the message that's offered to you today. So let's take it.